Alright, part 2, let's do it. So usually with these kind of tutorials, we cover how we create something from A to B, but this video would honestly just be way too long if I did that, so instead I'll cover my workflow techniques, specifically when working with something that's very organic, which is honestly where Modeler shines. If you've never tried sculpting in VR before, it's hard to kind of articulate just how freeing it is. Building up shapes is super fast compared to like conventional methods. So I decided to start with the coral basis to sort of set the scale of the scene. Since our buildings will rest upon these coral structures, I wanted to make a few variations of them. And this is where the Spline tool comes in really handy. The tool provides several parameters to determine the width and pointiness of each tip. And by moving both hands, you're able to dictate just how it twists and sits in 3D space, which honestly saves so much time, like compared to doing this manually. Such an amazing tool. Using the menu is really easy to add new layers and just continue laying down branches. Keeping the shapes separate on separate layers kind of makes them a lot easier to edit. And that also brings me to another tool, which is the warp tool. I think this is probably my favorite out of all of the other tools. Once you've laid down shapes, it's really easy to just use the warp tool and nudge the shapes. But note that there are two modes. So warp will kind of change the shape more dramatically, and elastic will preserve the volume a bit easier and affect a bigger radius. While creating these coral structures, I had to be very careful with the resolution, especially for the thinner branches. If you warp them a bit too much without adding resolution, they kind of become very fragile and break easily. But if you use the plus button to add more resolution as you go, it's easier to warp without that breakage happening. So one principle I think is important to note is to always break complex things down into simple shapes and build things up one at a time. For instance, for the flat tops of the coral structures, I used just a plain cylinder from the clay tool menu and warped the edges to give it a more organic feel. I also used the smooth tool to soften out all of the edges. And here's where the real power of the warp tool lies. If I duplicate some of the structures and if I've kept all the layering, it's super easy to create variations by either warping the branches or warping the main coral structure. Here you can see me drastically change one of the structures and even duplicate the top and branches to kind of add a second layer where I can place one or more houses. I was sort of thinking about it like mushrooms and how some tend to have these like different shelves and heights going on. And honestly, I just thought this would make everything look a lot more organic and interesting and would also give different heights to all of our buildings. This kind of workflow almost works as kitbashing, where you're basically reusing assets to save on time. Using Omercan's references as a guide, I tried to dissect each building and break them down into simpler shapes. Looking at the clay tool tray, cylinders, spheres, and rounded squares made up a lot of these buildings. Most of the buildings have very rounded shapes, and luckily there are parameters such as round and fillet to help achieve that effect. Also, I should mention, if I'm looking up into space a lot, I'm not seeing imaginary things. It's just that through my eyes, looking through the headset, there's an actual desktop window docked there with reference sketches. So really I'm just looking up a lot to make sure that I'm following the concepts accurately enough. Being able to import references directly into the scene will be a feature in the future. I'm putting each shape on a new layer, which is why everything else appears grayed out. This also happens when you've laid down a shape and choose to scope in to work specifically on that shape without interfering with anything around it. Also, I'm so sorry about the Dropbox notification. Hopefully it's not too distracting. Really should upgrade my Dropbox though. Anyway, sometimes when you work with the warp tool, you end up getting really messy shapes, so it might be worth using the erase tool to just crop things out. The erase tool is also super handy at carving out specific shapes, like for example the balcony area. At this point, you might wonder why a plane appears when I move objects. That's because I have Symmetry turned on to basically just save a lot of time. I think this model is a good example of this, as it was a very organic shape and trying to warp it without the symmetry would have proven quite difficult. Speaking of warping, this is also a good opportunity to show just how using the warp or elastic tool in combination with the gizmo can prove super useful. While in the process of warping, you can pull the affected area in one axis or even size down. This can drastically change the silhouette of your model, which I found very helpful in the beginning where you're just concepting and trying to nail down the initial silhouette of everything. What I'm trying to focus on in this part of the process is just that, the initial bases. Once I finish all of these, I will hand screenshots over to Omercan to draw over and add in further refinement and details. This is the back and forth that he was talking about earlier, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about instancing. Linking is another amazing feature that will be better illustrated later on when making the bridges in between these houses, but was very useful to me when figuring out how the houses fit onto the coral basis. Basically, when each house was done and grouped, I made that group an instance, and that way when I duplicated the house and moved it onto the coral structure, it was a linked copy of the original building. So whenever I change something on that building, the linked copy will change too. This is such a powerful feature, I highly recommend you guys give it a go. Another point I wanted to touch on is just how it's okay to be totally messy and figure things out on the go. The benefit of working with voxels in Modeler is that it's super easy to change the original shape, add, subtract, and so on. So there's really a lot of freedom that comes with that. You're not exactly pushing polys, but working free of a lot of 3D constraints that's usually put on us 3D artists. So I recommend honestly just having fun with it. I got that same feeling I did when I was a child, just working on things for fun while working on these houses. And these houses might not be perfect, but to me that kind of adds to the organic and handmade feeling of it all. These houses weren't made by a machine, but by human hands. Or, I mean, whatever species lives here. All of that actually brings me to another technique, which is how I created these external shapes on the outside of the houses. Now, this technique I attribute entirely to Gio Nakpil, I hope I'm pronouncing that okay, who used this method in the early days of Medium. Basically, you duplicate your original shape, size it down, and by scoping in on it, you can start pulling out shapes. This was a super fun way to add new shapes and break up the smooth surfaces of the buildings. If you remember Omercan's concepts, the buildings have these outer parts that are almost molded onto the building surfaces, and also have these spirals that make up the texture. I thought I'd combine the two and have some of the geometry make up these shapes, and also let some of the texturing in Painter do the rest. You'll see me refine this a lot more later on, but for now I'll leave them as rough gestures for future Christina to work on. So I think I've covered a lot of techniques created for the bases, and you're probably sick of hearing my voice already, so I will hand it back to Omercan to refine these concepts further.
Now that Christina has blocked out the structures roughly, I'm going to step in and draw over these to add adjustments and further detail. This is a big part of the back and forth workflow we tend to follow. It helps us constantly moving forward without having long stretches of time where one of us is waiting for too long without anything to do. This also offers a great opportunity to problem solve certain issues Christina might have encountered while sculpting. By drawing over, we can explore different ways of adding detail and refining form without losing too much time sculpting potential ideas that might not end up working in the end. I can also experiment with the potential texturing of these surfaces quickly so we can get that ball going at an early phase. This is what the final drawovers look like. You can see that in some parts I have changed the overall silhouette of the designs, as well as adding detail to within this silhouette. I varied the line weight to indicate clearly what's texture on the surface and what's actual form change. Overall, the important part is to keep the organic shape language consistent throughout each concept.
With Omercan's refined sketches done, I could now revisit the houses and start refining them. So just like with the paintings, while creating the bases, I stayed fairly zoomed out, but since I'm now working on further refinement, I allow myself to zoom in and focus on the details a bit more. I didn't give much thought to the door and window placements in the previous stage, but now I can finally start thinking about all of that. A new technique I used in the stage was to utilize Booleans, which means creating a custom shape and having that shape either add to or subtract from another shape. In my case, I wanted to carve out some windows, so instead of erasing and trying to get a perfectly shaped window, I found it a lot easier to just use Booleans, which there is a convenient little menu for. Using the knife tool, I would also separate two shapes and further mold that second shape into what I wanted it to be. This is what I meant by nailing the silhouette down first and further refining after. It's so much easier to create complex geometry once you have a base to work off of. And of course, because I love talking about this tool, here's another great example of the warp tool in action, which I really believe would be a lot more difficult to achieve without VR controls. You basically just grab onto a shape with the trigger button and just rotate your hand. It's just ridiculously easy to create freehand curly shapes this way. Time to create some rails that can be instanced over and over again. So keeping the door size in mind, I made the rails to scale. Using the shape language that's already been established throughout our entire scene, I tried to keep the shapes fairly rounded and repeated the poles. By linking the cylindrical shapes in the middle, I was able to reshape it and have it repeat throughout all of the shapes. On this model, I even used the warp tool to curl the railing and just moved the poles to adapt to the new shape. So with all of the houses done, I started working on the coral, finally. Now, my initial idea was to have the coral be very stylized, but after working on it for a while, I just didn't think it conveyed our idea well enough. Our idea was to have the coral be this organic matter that grows upwards and outside the houses, but this just felt like cheese. You'll see me change this later on. And honestly, that is totally fine. It's all about just putting ideas down, and it's not until you see the ideas in front of you, you'll kind of know if it works or not. But before we get there, we need to behold the birth of Pickle Man. I probably should have done this way earlier in the process, but I made this little dude to illustrate what someone who's about 2 meters tall would look like in the scene height-wise. And I basically just moved him around a lot as an illustrative way to kind of know that everything I'm making, especially windows and doors, are to scale. Hopefully Pickle Man won't give you nightmares. Once I had some of the coral shapes down, it was a lot easier to add these freeform shapes outside of the buildings. I followed Omercan's concepts freely and mostly just did whatever felt right to me in the moment. Here's another example of me using Booleans to cut out windows. I stored these Booleans on the side of the houses and not grouped in with any of the houses. That way I could use them freely wherever I saw fit. I also started thinking about the space inside of these houses and started hollowing them out. Although we actually won't be seeing inside any of these houses, some of them might have open spaces that give us a peek, and not having clean geometry inside sort of ruins the illusion. So this is honestly where VR is so great. It's difficult on a flat 2D screen to navigate easily within tight spaces without having geometry obstruct your view. But when you're in VR, you can scale up the world around you, making yourself tiny and inhabiting the space inside the houses. That way it's super easy to carve things from the inside out and clean up geometry in a very efficient way. Sometimes that meant adding more clay, and sometimes it meant carving out clay. I honestly can't gush about VR enough, it's just so much fun. At this point, I realized I had to do something about the corals. They had to be more organic and freeform and less rigid and with less perfect holes. Omercan had sent me a great reference picture, and I took that and tried to translate it as best as I could. Using the swept sphere tool, I was able to kind of sketch out some coral formations, and using this in combination with the smooth tool and the warp tool, I was able to get some pretty interesting effects. I used the warp tool to both punch in holes and to pull out the rims to create some deformations and more randomness. Essentially, that's what the coral structures are like. They're not perfectly crafted holes, but very organic in nature and not rigid at all. I had to admit that this process was very zen-like, and I totally spaced out in the best way. We had this idea that the coral material would be used not only to be carved into, but also as a material to reinforce structures and general areas of the building. Little story elements like this really makes up for a lot and makes the overall design of the place much more interesting. If you're able to communicate little story elements like that with just the concept alone, it adds so much to the piece. Creating the coral structures for the rest is pretty much the same exact process, so I won't show too much of it, but I did want to mention that the idea was to have the coral as an organic type of material, almost like those vines you see growing on houses. So I wanted it to kind of creep upwards, forcing the people to keep building on top of the bases to avoid getting swallowed up by the coral. With that said, that concludes part 2. Tune in for part 3, our final part, where we'll finally start putting all of these houses together in a scene, export from Modeler to either Blender or Painter, and use Unreal Engine 5 as our final destination, where we add some nice lighting, birds, mountains, and so on.